Washington, sometime deep into the war years, late. The White House mostly quiet except for the war itself, which never really goes quiet. Dispatches arriving at all hours, casualty numbers that read less like reports and more like a slow-motion collapse of an entire generation of young men. A single lamp burning in one room. A president who isn't sleeping, hasn't been sleeping most nights, for longer than anyone around him is comfortable admitting out loud. People who worked closely with Lincoln, his law partner back in Illinois, his personal secretaries in Washington, friends who'd known him for decades, all describe some version of the same thing. A man capable of a room-clearing sense of humor, famous for stories and jokes that could put an entire cabinet meeting at ease in seconds. And underneath that, on a different night, in a different room, a weight that some of them worried seriously might eventually kill him. Not on a battlefield, but by his own hand, in a private moment nobody was there to interrupt. Both of those things were true about the same man, often in the same week. That's not a contradiction you're supposed to resolve neatly. It's the actual shape of the story. Rewind well before the war, well before the White House, back to a young lawyer riding a circuit through rural Illinois, small towns, courthouse to courthouse, sleeping in shared rooms at country inns because that's simply how the job worked in that era. Even then, long before there was a war to explain it, people who knew him described stretches where he'd disappear into something dark enough that friends started keeping an eye on him. Not casually, genuinely worried. There's a documented period, decades before the presidency, where people close to him removed knives and razors from a room he was in because they didn't trust him alone with them. Let that sit for a second, because it matters for everything that comes after. This was not a condition manufactured by the pressure of leading a country through its bloodiest war. This was already there. Already a lifelong companion, showing up in his 20s and 30s, long before anyone had any reason to explain it as the weight of high office. The war didn't create the melancholy, it just handed it the biggest possible stage. Now move forward to the presidency itself, and understand exactly what kind of decade he walked into. A country splitting in half. Casualty counts that by the end would total more American dead than every other American war combined up to that point. And for long stretches of the fighting, no clear indication the Union was even going to win. Add to that something that has nothing to do with policy or strategy at all, personal loss, stacked directly on top of the national one. Lincoln and his wife had already buried one son before the presidency. During the war itself, they lose another. Willie, 11 years old, dead of illness in the White House, his body laid out for the public funeral in the East Room, while his father is simultaneously expected to run a war that's killing thousands of other people's children every month. There is no version of taking a few days off to grieve available to him. The dispatches keep arriving. The generals keep needing decisions. The war does not pause out of respect for a father's loss, and neither does the office. This is the actual crack in the story, not a single dramatic event, but the compounding weight of a lifelong condition, a national catastrophe, and a private, personal devastation, all landing on the same man at the same time, with absolutely no exit available to him. He can't resign. He can't disappear for a month. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, an entire country's fate, are functionally waiting on whatever he does next, whether he's currently capable of doing it well or not. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, in a way that most retellings skip past, because it's easier to tell a version where the hero grits through it and comes out the other side transformed. That's not quite what happened, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to what actually makes this useful to you. Lincoln doesn't fix the melancholy. There's no scene where he has a breakthrough and the darkness lifts for good. Visitors to the White House during the war describe finding him at his lowest, some mornings, in a state that by any modern description would be recognized immediately as a man in serious crisis. Withdrawn, silent, at times reportedly telling close associates he felt he could no longer safely be left alone with a blade in the room. The same warning sign that had followed him since his 20s. And then, hours later, in front of a cabinet meeting or a public audience, he's telling stories, genuinely funny ones, deploying humor as a tool, deliberately, the way you'd reach for any other instrument you needed for a specific job. Associates would sometimes get visibly annoyed that he was cracking jokes in the middle of grave meetings about troop losses, until they understood, or at least some of them eventually did, that the humor wasn't him failing to take the war seriously. It was maintenance. It was the exact thing keeping him functional enough to sit through the next impossible decision. There's an account, often repeated, worth telling because it captures the mechanism so cleanly, of Lincoln reading a comic piece aloud to his cabinet before delivering some of the war's heaviest news, and the room's visible discomfort at the mismatch. He reportedly told them something to the effect that if he didn't laugh sometimes, he would die. not as a dramatic flourish, as a stated fact about his own maintenance schedule. This wasn't a man who beat depression through sheer force of character, the way these stories often get flattened into for the sake of a tidy ending. This was a man who built, out of necessity, an entire private system for staying functional alongside a condition that never actually left. Humor deployed on a schedule, private writing used to process what couldn't be said publicly, long walks alone at odd hours, a documented habit of reciting poetry about mortality and loss almost obsessively during his darkest stretches, as if handling the subject directly, on his own terms, in private, made it slightly more survivable than pretending it wasn't there. None of this is glamorous. None of it resolves into a single triumphant scene. It's maintenance, repeated, imperfectly, for years, while an entire country's survival happened to be riding on whether the maintenance held. And here's the detail that should actually stop you for a second. At no point does he get the option of taking this seriously as a health problem the way you might today. There's no framework in that era for what he's dealing with beyond melancholy, a word that describes the mood without offering him anything close to modern treatment. He is essentially inventing his own coping architecture in real time, with fewer tools than exist today, under dramatically higher stakes than almost anyone will ever face, and somehow keeping a country's war effort coherent anyway. If you're waiting for the moment the darkness lifts and Lincoln walks out the other side healed, that moment doesn't arrive. And it's important you understand that's not a flaw in the story, it's the actual point. The turn here isn't a cure. The turn is a decision, made and remade constantly, to keep the country's business moving forward on the exact same day he might be at his personal lowest. Cabinet meetings happen, military orders get signed, public appearances get made, including the ones requiring him to project calm confidence to a terrified public, on mornings when associates privately worried about his state of mind. He never gets to separate the president from the man carrying this weight. They're the same schedule, the same hours, often the same afternoon. What he builds instead of a cure is a system sturdy enough to keep operating alongside the weight, indefinitely, for years, without the weight ever fully lifting. Think about the actual mechanics of that for a second, because it's more remarkable than the tidy version of the story usually lets on. Every single day of that war required decisions with body counts attached to them, made by a man who, by his own era's accounts and by modern understanding, was very likely dealing with clinical depression the entire time, with none of today's treatment available, and no ability to step back from the job even temporarily. Here's the principle, stated plainly, because it's easy to blur once the drama of the story takes over. Psychological pain doesn't need to be resolved before you're allowed to function. Lincoln is proof, about as extreme a proof as history offers, that the two things, carrying real, unresolved, lifelong psychological weight and functioning at an extraordinarily high level anyway, are not mutually exclusive. They ran in parallel for years, in the same man, often in the same afternoon. This isn't a story about willpower beating depression. Willpower does not beat depression. That's not how the condition works, then or now. This is a story about building maintenance systems sturdy enough to keep operating alongside something that isn't going away on its own schedule, and refusing to wait for the weight to lift before doing the next necessary thing anyway. Now bring it back to you, because this is where most people in the modern world get the framing exactly backwards. You've absorbed a version of mental health that says the feeling has to resolve first. You'll deal with the presentation once you feel less anxious about it. You'll have the hard conversation once the dread goes away. You'll get back to the gym once you feel motivated again. You're treating the feeling like a locked door that has to open before you're allowed through it. Lincoln didn't get that door to open, not once, not for good, across an entire war. What he got instead was a functioning system he could run even while the door stayed shut. Humor deployed on purpose, not because he felt like laughing, but because he'd learned it kept him operational. Private processing done consistently, not because it fixed anything, but because it made the next day survivable. A refusal to let the absence of relief become an excuse to stop showing up for the job in front of them. You don't need the anxious feeling to disappear before you send the email. You don't need to feel motivated before you go do the actual work. Feeling better and functioning well are two separate tracks, and you've been assuming they're the same track your entire life. Lincoln ran a country for 4 years of catastrophic war on the second track alone, because the first one, for him, essentially never fully opened. That should recalibrate something for you, not into a tidy, inspirational lesson, This isn't a story that wants you walking away thinking depression is a productivity hack if you frame it right. It's the opposite. It's permission to stop waiting for a feeling that might not be coming on your schedule, and to build the maintenance system anyway, however small, however imperfect, running in parallel with whatever weight you're actually carrying. So here's the real question, and it is not a comfortable one. What are you postponing right now, today, until a feeling finally goes away? A feeling that never actually promised you it would leave on any particular schedule. And what would you build instead if you stopped waiting for the door to open and just found a way to keep functioning alongside it, the way he did for years, in a job that never once gave him the option of stepping back until it was finished with him?